Somewhere in America, a phone is about to ring.
Welcome back to Shared Humanity. My name is Nelba Márquez-Greene, and in this podcast and video series, I talk to the humans behind the headlines of gun violence in a moment in history where all too often we focus on everything but. May these stories give you new perspective and empower you to hope in action. Today's guest is Dr. Bruce Perry. He's principal of the Neurosequential Network and a professor at La Trobe University in Melbourne, Australia. Over the last 30 years, Dr. Perry has been an active teacher, clinician, and researcher in children's mental health and the neurosciences, holding a variety of academic positions. His work on the impact of abuse, neglect, and trauma on the developing brain has impacted clinical practice, programs, and policy across the world. He is author of The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, Born for Love, Why Empathy is Essential and Endangered, and in his most recent book, co-authored with Oprah Winfrey, What Happened to You? Conversations on Trauma, Resilience, and Healing. He has reached audiences across the world, the book being translated into over 26 languages and on the New York Times Bestseller list for over 100 weeks. Today's interview is a little different. Dr. Perry is a friend. He is a primary responder to many communities that have been impacted by gun violence, and he was a primary responder to me. I'm hoping that by listening to this interview, you'll gain some insight into what could actually make us healthier, make us a little more whole, and why gun violence as a public health issue just makes sense. Hi, Dr. Perry.
Hi, Nelba.
How are you?
I'm well. And you know you don't have to call me Dr. Perry.
I do. I'm a little emotional, though. You know, it's been January 13th. 25. It's been about 12 years for us now. It's been about 12 years, and I'm so thankful that I know you. So I first came to know you through your work in one of the books that you wrote, you co-authored, called The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. I was a young master's-seeking person in marriage and family therapy, and I read this extraordinary book. And there was one chapter in particular. All of the chapters are brilliant, but one of them in particular on healing and communities, chapter 11, that stood out to me as just something that I'd never read before, I'd never heard anybody talk about, and it stayed with me. It stayed with me as I started as a supervisor of graduate level students. It stayed with me as I started being an adjunct faculty at university. And it stayed with me when we came back to Connecticut. And Jimmy and I and Isaiah and Anna moved back to Connecticut in the summer of 2012. And everybody knows, what happened on December 14th, 2012. And I actually worked in that moment on an interdisciplinary team with a psychiatrist and a psychologist. And we were all working together. And I got mailed that book by the psychiatrist on my team. And he said, I know you're not going to read one damn book on grief, but I know how much you love this one. Did I ever tell you that story before?
No. You're making me get all teary up. I hope we're not going to cry through this whole interview.
No, we're not going to cry through this whole interview. But that book and receiving it and healing and communities became a central theme in our journey post Sandy Hook. Can you talk a little bit about this framework?
Yeah. I'm so happy that you honed in on that chapter, because that chapter, that's almost 20 plus years old now, because I wrote the book with Maya many, many years ago. And one of the dominant elements of traditional mental health service delivery was come to my office and sit with me, and I'll do some kind of magical voodoo with you, and then you'll get better. And there continues to be quite a disrespect to the natural healing capabilities of culture and community. Now, I think it's better. Things are getting better, but the more we learn about the way human beings work, the way human beings manage stress, distress, dysfunction, grief, loss, hard things and good things, the more we realize that community and connection facilitated by culture is really at the core of health, not just mental health, but physical health, social health, creative health, and so forth. And I was just beginning to understand that. And when I wrote that into that chapter, part of what I was trying to get people to think about was the fact that in a large-scale event where there's a natural disaster, community catastrophe that's man-made, like war or a school shooting, that the number of people that are impacted would swamp the traditional mental health service delivery model. You couldn't have enough therapists trained in TFCBT to even scratch the surface. Yeah. And as you experience, one of the things that we saw time and time and time again in our work was that in the immediate aftermath of a high-profile, catastrophic, traumatic event, all kinds of people step forward to help and offer services. And again, it's all well-intended, but in a week or 2 or 3 weeks and in a month, their energy, enthusiasm, attention, participation in the process just dissipates. And when people really start to need it is when all of those supports are gone and you have to rely upon the natural supports of your family, your extended family, your community of faith, your culture, your neighborhood. And I saw again and again and again that healing happened in communities. It didn't happen in the office. And so that's kind of what I tried to write about in that chapter. And to this day, that continues to be a big part of our efforts to get the mental health world to kind of shift their brains out of the medical model and into a more public health, public engagement, community-derived model for addressing a lot of these problems.
You talk, and a lot of your work is about the birth to 5 and early childhood experience and those things which better prepare us for having long-term health and wellness. Could you talk to us about that?
Sure. Human beings are, we're complex organisms. We have all kinds of things in our body, including our brain, that are continually working to help us survive and thrive in the world. And really at the heart of it is what we would broadly refer to as our stress response systems, which are kind of front-loaded to our brain. I mean, there's a lot of other parts of the stress response system that are in other parts of our body, but the brain really is kind of driving our ability to process all the incoming information from the world and sort it and figure out how to have an appropriate response in the moment so that we can survive and kind of get through the day. So every day, everybody is stressed in one way or another. And the stress might be something as simple as a traffic jam or a child who's crying and is inconsolable because they didn't make the soccer team or something like that. That's a stressor. And there are all sorts of stressors. And our body works together, and our brain is leading this process to manage all of that. Now, when there's a catastrophic stress, these systems get taxed. They get overwhelmed. They have to work really, really, really hard. And because they're sort of entering a new state of required activity, rather than using their temporary organization, they make changes to go, hey, my world's crazy and chaotic and I have to be high alert and vigilant. So I'm going to make longer term changes so that I can manage this. And so these systems change. And when that happens, in the beginning, that's adaptive, because if your world stays chaotic, you need to sort of be able to adapt to it. But once the traumatic event passes or that those circumstances change, the body doesn't change just like that. You stay tuned up and dysregulated, and all the things that go with that persist. Now, the reason early childhood is so important is that the flexibility of these systems and their capacity to be more appropriately responsive to the challenges of the world that capability is related to how resilient those systems are made early in life. And what we know is that again, human beings develop, and we don't just pop into existence as a fully functional small adult. We have to develop. And in the brain, one of the major drivers of how all parts of the brain develop is your stress response networks.
Here's what I found.
That are influenced by early developmental
Speaking of
experiences.
stress.
Yes, really. Yes, hello. Yes, my watch is speaking to me. Apologies. So this is one of the things that we know, and I think anybody who's been a coach or a parent recognizes this pattern. When stress occurs in a way that it's related to a predictable, moderate challenge. So, for example, you're an orchestra and you have to practice and practice and practice because there's going to be a recital. That's a stressor, but it is predictable. It's controllable. The degree of the distress you feel while you perform is going to be related to how much you practice. You have control of it. It's not catastrophic, even if you make a mistake and start over, and you get through it. And what happens is it's like weightlifting. When you have a stressor that's moderate, it's like going to the gym and lifting a moderate amount of weights. And if you do that again and again and again, pretty soon you're like, wow, that's really light. I need to go up on my weight. And that's what stressors of the right kind can do. So like when you're a baby, a newborn, these just developing systems in the brain will be activated when you get hungry, and you will cry, and the caregiver comes and meets your fundamental needs, hunger, thirst, cold, and the stress response system kind of goes back to baseline. And then you get hungry again, and you get moderately distressed, and you'll express that, and the caregiver comes, and you get back to your baseline. And so if you have a present, attentive, and attuned caregiving group, granny, auntie, dad, mom, older brother, the infant and child who's in that environment develops a stress response system that is much more capable of weightlifting when you get older, right? So it's stronger and more capable, and it can do more. So when real life challenges come along, they're able to sort of have this appropriate response, but then get back to their baseline more quickly and not get stuck in this overdrive state that has all kinds of negative consequences. And this, again, is one of the things that we're continuing to try to learn a little bit more about this. But back to your earlier comment about community, what we know is that anybody who's ever had a baby knows it's a lot of damn work. It's hard. And if you have the full responsibility yourself to take care of a newborn and a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old, and you don't have extended family around to help, you don't have neighbors to come in and help, you're going to be really stretched. So this is where community is so important in those early years, that the support of young families by distributing the caregiving burden really allows the parent to be engaged in these really powerful, rewarding, and regulating experiences in a way where they're fully present. They have enough energy and enough bandwidth to be there, and they're not continually exhausted. And so our modern world, the way we've constructed our modern world, has really gotten us into a little bit of trouble. Yeah. We are, even though we are, it seems like we're in this progressive environment, right? The truth is we are biologically much more vulnerable now than we were in previous generations because we are so fragmented and disconnected from each other. And I'm rambling. I'm sorry. I don't know. But
No, you're doing. You often say and have said and have written, and I've resonated with this so much, that we used to normalize living in intergenerational groups, in intergenerational households, where children had many people to care for them, right? And could look at models of, how do I deal with anger? How do I deal with happiness? How do I deal with frustration? And now we have almost normalized parents, caregiver one, and doing everything alone, and how that makes us more vulnerable because everyone needs community. One of the most, something I watch of yours all the time, and I don't know if I've shared this with you before, this is basically Nelba's confessional, is you did a video, and it's an older video, First Impressions, and it's the impact of violence on the brain. And I think it was with in Arizona, but it was really teaching parents about why we need regulated states at home and the impact of violence on the brain. Do you remember that video?
I vaguely.
You've done so many. Basically, what I'm trying to ask is, I meet so many different kinds of parents.
Yeah.
But the one thing that unites every single person I talk to is they all want to know what they can do to make their child best prepared for the future, to get the best outcome. If you had to, on a granular level, talk to a parent and say, here's the thing, what would you say?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because throughout all of our work, there are, as you well know, I can go off and get completely theoretical and esoteric and talk about really obscure aspects of how the brain works, but that you can boil all of that down into a couple of really important observations. The first one is that people change when there is a relationally mediated moment. It doesn't have to be an hour long. It doesn't have to be formal where you sit down. It's these tiny micro moments that have powerful emotional meaning, where someone they feel connected to you. You quote, the language people use a lot is, I feel seen, you understand me, you're connected with me. But those are incredibly powerful moments where you can make people feel safe, which will have a physiological impact on their stress response. They'll be better regulated. It will also reward the systems in their brain that give you a sense of pleasure. So you won't seek pleasure in unhealthy ways, right? Through too much sugar, too much, there's lots of unhealthy ways to get that feeling of reward. The healthiest way to get that feeling of reward is to be in the presence of somebody who is sending you nonverbal cues of respect, love, attention, and parents can do that all the time. Now, here's the dilemma. If a parent is so overwhelmed themselves, if they're sleep deprived, if they're overworked, if they're exhausted and they're frustrated, the ability to have those moments to sort of just put everything out of your head and be there right in this moment right now, that's hard to do if you don't take care of yourself. So here's what I would say to parents. Listen, I know it sounds selfish, but you cannot provide the best experiences for your child if you don't make sure that you get sleep, you eat well, you exercise, you have friends, you're connected to people that feed you emotionally. And then you'll be able to give these moments to your kids that are making lifelong changes in their biology and making lifelong impressions that they'll carry forward in a good way. And that's for me, the exciting part of this is that the biology of human connection is so powerful that when it happens, and it doesn't have to be, like I said, it doesn't have to be hours, it's moments. You remember those moments, and they can have just enduring impact on your physiology and enduring impact on the way you see the world and the way you feel about yourself.
So as you're saying that, I remember that is the exact advice you gave to me and to Jimmy when we reached out to you in January of 2013 and said, how do we do this? What's the therapy? What's the thing? And you were like, no. That's, are you eating? Are you sleeping? Are you and Jimmy taking care of yourselves? Because the only way Isaiah is going to be okay is if you and Jimmy are okay. And it doesn't have to be perfect. And it will not be perfect. Right. So I don't want anybody listening saying, I have to be this perfect every single time getting it right. Our kids are not looking for perfection. And you are consistent in your advice, Dr. Perry. Did you know that?
I'm glad to hear that.
Yes, you are consistent. The next question I wanted to ask you is about ACEs. Your work in the neurosequential model adds a little bit of perspective and meat to the bones of ACEs. And ACEs is adverse childhood experiences. And you have a little bit of a different take on the framework of ACEs. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. Let me just preface this by saying that I have tremendous respect for those studies. In fact, I've been a co-author on some of those articles.
Sure.
But I think what's happened is a lot of people took what were epidemiological studies, and again, you can't blame them because they're not used to reading science articles. The process of doing research involves looking at a sliver of reality and trying to make some sense out of it. And that's what they did. They took 10 adversities, and they looked at whether or not that increased risk for physical health, social health, mental health problems. And it did. And one of the most powerful things about that study was that even though all of that stuff was already known, I mean, every single thing the ACE study said had been researched by other people in a different way. So there were other people out there trying to talk to the world about this. But what was so powerful about the ACE studies was that it actually used the language of the dominant power structure in society, which is, at least in our world, is medicine. They actually said, health problems get worse. We knew that if kids had adversities, if somebody had a history of child abuse and neglect and all this kind of stuff, we knew that they did poorly in school. We knew there were increased risk for juvenile justice issues. We knew they had increased risk for everything. But nobody would listen to social scientists. Honestly, I hate to say it, but they were like, yeah, whatever. Right. But when it was physicians saying it changes your risk for heart disease, then people were like, oh my gosh, it must mean something. And that was the power of those studies. And I remember talking with Rob Andin, Vince Folletti several times early on after that article was published. And we were just amazed that nobody in the medical community was even aware of the studies. And we would typically, we were going and giving talks all kinds of places and saying, who's heard of the ACE study? And even 8-9 years afterwards, I would go to a community of physicians and maybe 3 people would have heard of it. And so it takes a long time for stuff to kind of get out there. Right. And then part of what happened was, even though the people that did the ACE studies recognized the limitations of those studies, they didn't look at everything. They didn't have every adversity. They didn't look at every population. They didn't look at counterbalancing positive relational things. People just kind of grabbed onto it like a movement. So it's become a movement as opposed to actually a singular piece of scientific evidence that contributes to the world. So I don't try to push back on that. Right. I just have to recognize that, listen, this is the way people have an easier time thinking about linear causality than than complexity. And so even back then, and you can see this is kind of what that chapter was about that you mentioned in that book, we were very well aware that relational connection was a buffer to adversity.
Right.
And so if we started to look at positive childhood experiences counterbalanced negative childhood experiences. And as you well know, the model we use really looks at both, looks at the timing and the nature of experiences, good and bad, to come up with a global estimate of developmental risk at different times in life. And we feel that that's just it's incomplete, but it's a little bit of a finer examination. Again, if you use the imagery of mapping some unknown territory, the ACE study is like flying over 50,000 feet. And when you start to add in, positive childhood experiences, and you get down to like 20,000 feet. But you still are not, you still have to get each person's story. This is the challenge, is that we have to stop clumping people together. It's good to clump people together to address and understand certain things, but that doesn't help you understand that person. So I know people that have had 8 ACEs, and they're very different than a person who has had 8 ACEs and 3 PACEs. And the 8 ACEs were in the first 2 years of life versus the, ages 8 to 12. And so everybody has a story. That's the beauty of this. And this is for me, one of the biggest challenges of our current mental health service delivery model, is that we are lumpers. We clump people together, and we give them labels, and we categorize them, and we put them through this mill of, here's your problem, here's your pill, here's your label, here's your pill, here's your label, here's your evidence-based treatment, where there's honestly minimal evidence anyway, but let's do it because I get reimbursed. We are not saying stop that. Go out into their neighborhood, get to know who their people are, get to know where they came from. And once you do that, all of the stuff that you see makes complete sense. You're like, oh, well, of course. And we over pathologize, right? One of the biggest areas we pathologize people around is grief.
Yes.
I mean, what the hell? If you feel bad about losing your child after 6 months, that's pathological. Honestly, what the I mean, excuse my language.
We're not just lumpers of people. We're lumpers of solutions. So if that one size fits all doesn't work for you, then we're going to add to the pathology of whatever it is we're trying to do. But you said earlier that we have to know people's story. And what you did was actually invite the world to transition from asking the question, what's wrong with you, to what happened to you. You actually invited the world, and you did it in this really interesting way. You co-authored a book of these thoughts and ideas you've been working on for decades. People think it just kind of came out of the blue, and then Bruce Perry just blew up with what happened to you. I mean, that's some people who don't know your work, and that's not. You've been working on this for decades, and you co-authored this book with Oprah Winfrey, What Happened to You, bringing these questions and these concepts to popular culture. I think it's been translated into like 26 different languages. That's what I read.
Yeah, it's about 32 now, I guess. I mean, it's
32 now.
Yeah,
okay.
It's kind of crazy. Yeah.
How did you, I don't want to say how did you, because I've been with you through some of that process, just knowing you for 12 years. But I know I couldn't have been more deeply proud when that came out, because what I thought was more people are going to learn about this relational piece, this how the brain works piece, this information piece. I mean, it's just incredible. Could you tell us about that process?
Well, first of all, Nelba, thank you. It means a lot for you to say that. The process was kind of interesting because it's in many ways people view this as sort of a success, a reflection of a successful relationship with Oprah, which it kind of was. But I view it as the culmination of an unsuccessful relationship process of trying to teach her about these concepts. And so let me just describe what I mean by that. I've known Oprah for more than 30 years. And in the entire time I have known her, I have been trying to communicate the same things to her. You mentioned that I give the same advice, I tell the same. These things that I talk about are not that new. We have more data, we have more evidence, other people are adding to that data set. But, 30 years ago, we were very well aware of all of these things. But I must have been a very bad communicator. And so I would see her, we'd talk about something, and I try to talk about stress, distress, sensitization, the brain, relational health, all this stuff. And it was like, it didn't go anywhere. And little by little by little by little, through a variety of things, there was a big series of abuse allegations and abuse events that took place at her school in South Africa. And I was involved in helping her with that. And, we worked together on a couple of different things. So and aside from work related things, we had a relationship like people have relationships. And so when she retired from her show, she became a special correspondent for 60 Minutes. And so she could pick any story that she wanted to do. And she was reading a newspaper article from Milwaukee, which was one of her she spent some time growing up there and has some family there. So she read about this program where they were doing innovative work with women who had been victims of domestic violence, and they were in a shelter, and she thought that was great. So she went to Milwaukee, wanted to do a story on it. And one of the things that they said was, we use this approach that was developed by this guy named Dr. Bruce Perry. And she goes, Dr. Bruce, I know Dr. Bruce. So she called me up and said, you want to be on 60 Minutes? And I'm like, oh. And it sounds like a really flattering thing, but honestly, it's quite a pain in the ass because you commit a bunch of time and then they cherry pick maybe 30 seconds of your conversation.
Well, they were an impressive 30 seconds because we watched that 60 Minutes episode as a family, and my son looked at me and said, Mom, that is an expensive suit. I still remember.
When he told me that, I just started to laugh because he's right, and I have one suit, so and it's that suit. But it's a nice suit.
And it was a great show, but even my little one at that time said it knew it was an expensive suit.
Well, it's 12 minutes though, right? Think about it now. Well, Nelba, you know how the media works. They get a little soundbite, and I just was like, I don't really want to do it because she wanted me to fly to Milwaukee, and I said, all right, I did it because it's kind of as if we're friends. So we did this interview, and one of the things that happened when we were having lunch afterwards was that there was a child there who had been given all kinds of opportunities and efforts and resources and things that were going, that should have helped him. And as you and I've talked about a million times, these were the conventional medical model things. Your path, there's a pathology that you have. I'm going to, as the person with all the wisdom and power, I'm going to tell you what's wrong with you and give you medications and make you better. And so he had all of these services, and he still was struggling and acted out. And at one point, Oprah, while we're having lunch, said, God, I can't figure this out. This kid had all of these benefits, all these people stepping up to help him, all these programs, and he still did whatever. What's wrong with this kid? And I said, and I just want to be clear about this. This is not my phraseology. This is from a guy named Joe Fodero, who is a social worker who's now passed away, who worked with Sandy Bloom in Philadelphia. And they had just started a sort of a trauma-informed perspective many, many years ago. And they were beginning to shift from looking at, the symptoms and figuring out where do the symptoms come from? Right. And so he said, it's not as if we're asking what's wrong with you anymore. We're asking what happened to you. And so Sandy Bloom, very good communicator, picked up on this. And so in our field, that phraseology was pretty common. So I said that to Oprah. I said, it's not really that what's wrong with him. If you knew what happened to him, you'd understand why he acted this way. And it was almost as if everything crystallized, all those years of talking to her about this stuff, she finally got it. And so she insisted on that was going to be the title of the book. But anyway, what happened was the book came about because Bob Miller, the publisher of Flatiron, who works with Oprah at that publishing house, called her up and said, "Hey, that piece was great. Would you think that Bruce Perry would be willing to write a book about this?" And so I she asked me, and I said, "Well, I wrote a book, but nobody read it." And, it was The Boy Who Raises a Dog. And it's like, they don't want to hear from me. This is interesting because they want to hear from you. And she said, "Well, I'm not going to write a book about this." And I said, "Well, why don't we just record some conversations? We talk about it all the time and turn that into a book." And that's kind of what we did. So.
Well, it again has been translated into 32 different languages, and if you don't have a copy of What Happened to You, it can really, really help put some things into perspective. I have purchased copies for teachers, for schools, and it is just an excellent resource written in everyday language to just kind of help us all understand community, connection, our brains, and how important they are. And I want, in a moment of full disclosure, to say that I also needed to understand how we also create individuals like Adam Lanza and other kids who grow up and make choices that are quite different than ones I have made or Isaiah has made or Jimmy has made. Yeah. And your books also offer insight into what some of those pieces are that go into, for example, ruptures with relationships with primary caregivers in early childhood. Yeah. Having no one to talk to or be there for you. And it was really important for me to understand that as a mom, as a therapist, and as a human being. I do notice that despite holding space and understanding why certain people are just going to make choices that are just so hard for the rest of the world to understand, there is now almost using what happened to you as a reason to say, look, there can be no consequence. It's almost like people have misinterpreted gentle parenting. People have critics of gentle parenting say, well, that means there are no consequences. And I don't understand that to be the case at all. Just like I don't understand your book to be a thing that is kind of encouraging no consequence whatsoever. This is information. This is not no consequence. Could you tell us a little bit about that? Or if I'm wrong, please call me out on that too.
Well, I think part of what happens, and it goes back to something I mentioned earlier, is that people feel more comfortable with simple linear explanations. And holding complexity in their head is hard. And again, as I wrote about, you're very well aware of, because you know this content inside and out. But one of the things that happens when people feel stressed or threatened or hungry or thirsty or frustrated or scared is that their stress response systems make these adaptations that are theoretically going to help them. But one of those includes shutting down the part of your brain that is very reflective, that's very thoughtful, that thinks about the long-term consequences of your behavior. We become literally more reactive, and in a real way, we become dumber when we feel threatened. And when there is something we don't understand, or something doesn't fit our worldview, it doesn't seem to fit, the default response is to get a little dysregulated, and to rather try to understand it is to try to vilify it and marginalize it and push it away. And when people get into, quote, discussions/arguments about responsibility for committing, why did Billy do this bad thing? It's very easy for people to fall back into that kind of reactive way of thinking and assume that just because you can explain something or describe why you think it happened, it doesn't mean that you're absolving somebody from responsibility for doing it.
And one final question I'm going to ask you, and it's really how I get to the School of Public Health, is because I'm incredibly encouraged by this idea of looking at gun violence as a public health issue, looking at gun violence as a public health issue specifically like we do here, both in the prevention side and also in the care side. The what do we do and what are the programs and how do we effectively address the millions, because even the millions of people living with gun violence, because even if we ended it today at 3:00, we have magically ended gun violence. We still have so many people left behind. So what are the community programs? What are the therapies? What are the interventions? I often say that survivors of gun violence are very unique. They sit at the intersection, not just of grief, but of grief, trauma, and injustice.
Yeah.
And our interventions, our medical model does not currently have a framework to address grief, trauma, and injustice, that three-legged stool, as I like to call it. Even the best therapist without their own personal framework of addressing injustice is going to fail a survivor if they're just saying, hey, we just need you to find acceptance. We just need you to, because we pathologize people who don't get to that place. But gun violence is very different. It literally should not have happened, should never be here. It's happening all the time. So you get re-traumatized and re-triggered.
Yeah.
So it's injustice, grief, and trauma all at once. But I am deeply encouraged by being here at the Yale School of Public Health and doing some of the work that I get to do with the researchers and with folks. Do you have any thoughts on kind of finding solutions?
Well, first of all, I think that a public health approach to gun violence is much more sensible and much more likely to be effective than any other current format within our traditional structures. I think the same is true about child abuse and neglect. That if we do not take a public health approach that focuses on primary prevention, community building, it integrates housing and economics into the problem-solving process, we're just spitting into the wind. The vast majority of parents or kids who end up in the child welfare system, it's not because their parents wanted to abuse them or their parents were bad. It's they're struggling. And we have so much data that if we create stability, safety, respect, and opportunity in the communities, child abuse and neglect it doesn't go away completely, but it really tremendously decreases. I think that the same thing that a public health approach to mental health is, and physical health are also much more effective than traditional get sick, come to my office approaches. And I think, honestly, not only are they more effective, they're going to be necessary because the scope of the problems is well beyond the current capacity and even beyond a projected capacity that would, we did this, for example, some numbers related to the earthquake in Turkey where we were working. If we took every single therapist in Turkey and they spent 100% of their week treating the people that were impacted by the earthquake in Turkey, there would still be 50% of the population would be unserved. And And so literally it's a physically impossible problem-solving model. It will never work, and we need to abandon it and move towards things that we know do work. We know that violence, trauma, grief, injustice existed well before our current systems did. And the way all of those things were managed by traditional indigenous cultures involved these relationally based, rhythm and relationship infused, culturally embodied approaches that brought people back into community, that created opportunities for safety, for respect, for regulation. And it, the amount of pathologizing was minimal. And we have to learn from those sort of, I can't think of any better evidence on the planet than looking at the development of core principles of healing and creation of health that independently arose on 6 different continents. It just would not have happened if it didn't work, if there wasn't something effective about some of those things. So when we look and see these common elements of community meals, community dance, community music, having an overarching framework where you try to put some meaning into the event, even if the meaning is wrong. I mean, even if you think that the earthquake happened because you weren't respectful to some deity, that's helpful for the people who are trying to understand how they lost a loved one in an earthquake. And I think that this is part of what we just have to start to, we have to recognize that if we're going to move forward, we have to have the ability to be like a microscope and have a lens that goes all the way down and looks at genetics, and then turn the lens and come back and look at the individual, turn the lens, come back and look at the family, turn the lens, come back and look at the community and culture. All of them have value and they're all interrelated. But if we stay just with one lens and try to problem solve and create policy from that, we get nowhere. And this is kind of what we're doing right now. We're spinning our wheels in so many fields because we are not using those multiple perspectives to enrich the way we create solutions. And I think public health, more than any other sort of area of medicine, area of the social sciences, does that.
I couldn't agree more. You have dropped so many gems today, and you drop so many gems every time I talk to you. There's one thing you said, there's 1,000 things you've said that have stuck with me since I first heard them. And that one thing I want to bring up today is that you said that in the United States, we tend to follow a rhythm of reimbursement, which is not necessarily a rhythm of healing, right? And that if you can't access formal therapy, if you can't access, if getting to a appointment at 4:45 on a Thursday because there's no bus line, there are also other things. There are therapeutic moments. There are community programs. There are other ways of healing that we can additionally look at that doesn't exclude you from health, and we need to be thinking that as well. So there are so many gems that you drop all the time, and I'm just so grateful. If I could think of a person who is just funny, just super freaking funny, and also lives out the esoteric and theoretical things that he says all the time, for you to have picked up the phone in January 2013 of a grieving mom and actually have to look me in the face and also stay connected through all these years, I can give you nothing. I literally, if you ever charge me, I could maybe pay you in meatballs and like rubber purple love wins bracelets. But, that's it. And you stay here.
I have Is this? Did you see this backwards? Right? Oops. Oh.
No, I saw it. No, we see it the right way. We see it the right way. You got my coasters. Yay, you're using my coasters.
I use them all the time.
I would say, as someone who has contributed so much to the public, yes, academia, yes, medicine, but also the general public, on how we can actually heal and make this world a better place, I could not thank you on behalf of myself, my family, my son, who thinks you're a snazzy dresser and have great hair.
Yeah, he'll love this.
Who, by the way, humbled me to no end yesterday because he said, Mom, what did you do? And I said, I recorded a podcast and I'm doing another one tomorrow with Bruce Perry. And he goes, you have a podcast, Mom? I mean, it's only been 6 months I've been doing this.
I love it.
Apparently he doesn't know that I've been doing this. But anyway, thank you so much, Dr. Perry. Is there anything I didn't ask you that I've left off the table that you want to say?
Nelba, we could have dozens of these conversations. And so, listen, I love you. I love your family. I'm sorry for the way I got to know you.
But I am so grateful that you are in our lives. I count my blessings on that. Thank you so much, Dr. Perry.
Keep up the good work, my friend.
Take good care. You too.
The world. Oh, yeah.
You too.
Right.
Bye. Thank you for listening. Shared Humanity is produced by the Yale School of Public Health. Follow us on social media at Yale SPH and learn more at sph.yale.edu/sharedhumanity. Thank you to the Yale Porvu Center and Yale Broadcast Studio for their support.
Somewhere in America, a phone is about to ring.